What's up, everyone? Welcome into the program. It's the Power Grid, part of the Footballguys.com podcast family. I don't speak too fast because if I do, there's trouble. I am your host, Cecil Lammy, joined by the best and brightest minds of Footballguys.com has to offer. And certainly in DFS, these are the guys you want to listen to. Every single week when I'm taking notes and these guys are talking, you want to know why? Because I'm winning in DFS every week because of these guys. I owe you all a cold, frosty beverage. That includes Devin Knotts, Jeff Pasquino, fresh from the shower, Austin Lee, you're not getting away with that, and John Lee, of course, and special guest this week, Maurile Tremblay. And Maurile, we're going to kick things off with you as we'll go through some news and notes before we get to Vegas. And some of the news and notes, of course, when we look at Miami at Baltimore, this is Mike Wallace saying that he's eyeing this matchup. You have on the flip side of that, you have a Miami offensive line that is getting healthier. What does that mean for Ajayi? Just when we thought Devontae Parker could be a sneakier play, now he's banged up. Does it mean more Jarvis Landry? Like so many storylines in this narrative. And does Flacco, kind of light things up against Miami this week? Maurile, welcome to the show, and your thoughts on Miami at Baltimore.
I don't like this game a lot. Vegas puts it at 40.5, which is the bottom of the barrel this week in terms of over-unders. And Miami is giving up 3.5 points to Baltimore. So on the Miami side, on both sides, there aren't a lot of players I really like in this game. Ajayi is the best bet. He gets enough volume that good things can happen. But I'm shying away from the passing game with Devontae Parker isn't fully healthy. That leaves Jarvis Landry and Kenny Stills to receive passes from Tannehill. And I'm not confident about any of those guys on that side of the game. So Ajayi will depend on his price at different sites. He's worth thinking about, but I'm not really touching anybody else from this game. Even on the Ravens side, I'm just not seeing a lot of value here in terms of production versus cost on the different sites I've looked at. Steve Smith is always a home run hitter who could explode, but I don't feel comfortable with him this week against Miami.
Oh, and if only Jeff Pasquino's man, Dennis Pitta, would actually score touchdowns. Pasquino, to you in a bit, but John, I want to bounce this next one off you because it's Detroit at New Orleans, and we're going to have some recency bias with a few players. The guys that got 0 targets, the guys that one of them Eli Manning apologized to, and Sterling Shepard, of course, but Brandon Cooks in Detroit at New Orleans. In this contest, the next one up we're going to talk about, Drew Brees, does he go back to Cooks? It's kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease in. We've heard, Cooks is upset about his role, all these things. And, of course, 0 targets. And when people are burned, they're going to stay away from that guy. Do you fully expect that? On the Detroit side of things, we've seen that team kind of win in different ways. Do they go back to winning with their offense? Riddick a little bit banged up. Marvin Jones not trustworthy at all at this point. Even Golden Tate has been hot and cold, mostly cold recently. So what are your thoughts on Detroit and New Orleans, and specifically what happens with Brandon Cooks after that fat 0 last week?
Yeah, so Cooks, we're playing the squeaky wheel gets the grease this week. He certainly should see some action. The mitigating factor there is Darius Slay. Slay should line up across from Cooks for at least 35%, maybe 40% of his snaps this week. I think another equally, he should go up against, Michael Thomas for about the same amount. So both of these guys are going to see Darius Slay in coverage. The marquee matchup this week, if you're going to get a receiver on the Saints, I think is probably Willie Snead. Willie Snead, he goes up against Quandre Diggs, who I talked about last night on the show with Austin over there on Roto Grinders. He's giving up a 91% completion rate when balls are thrown into his coverage this year. That is absolutely insane. 125 quarterback rating. And as we're saying, if Slay is locking down the outside, then a lot of stuff is going to go into the middle to Snead. And so that's the direction I think I want to go this week. Snead has been very consistent throughout the year. So I would be leaning that direction, although I do think that Brees, being the professional that he is, will try to get some action over to Cooks. And with recency bias, as you point out, I think that Cooks will go under-owned after burning so many people last week. On the other side of the ball, this is a great game, by the way. I mean, try to get as much exposure to it as you can. I think we'll talk about it in a bit, but this is the highest Vegas total on the entire year. Here we are in week 13, so definitely a lot of fantasy goodness to be had here. On the other side of the ball, the person I think you have to look at is Stafford. I don't think they're going to run the ball a whole lot in this game. The game script sets up well for the passing, and he's got a lot of receiving weapons, including Theo Riddick, who he uses as a receiver. I don't know who it's going to be on that side of the ball, whether it's Marvin Jones, whether it's Golden Tate. If I had to guess, that's who it would be. But Eric Ebron has been seeing a lot of action the second half of the season. I don't think you can go wrong with Stafford. I do think that you can swing and miss with some of his receivers because he does have a lot of people to throw to. I could talk about this game for another 20 minutes, but suffice it to say it's a great game to get involved with DFS this weekend.
Yeah, and I'm sure when we get to Vegas, it will be mentioned as well. Austin, you're up, and you get to handle the Gronk news that we got today. Just for the viewing audience and the listening audience, we do record this on Thursday, and, Gronk surgery. There's Martellus Bennett, real juicy, but, again, recency bias. He's done nothing. And fantasy owners will shy away. Will you be shying away? This one's at home in Foxborough. We know Chris Hogan's getting a little bit healthier. We know Julian Edelman has top 10 potential this week at the wide receiver position. Your thoughts there? Do we see something from Bennett now with Gronk down? Or does it just mean more of Deion Lewis and James White? If you look at the snap count last week between those three backs, and I'll throw in LeGarrette Blount, it was like 26 for Blount, 23 for White, and 22 for Lewis. I'm close there, but those were the numbers. You see that even split. What about this week against the Rams? And on the flip side, is there anyone that you would trust from the LA team when you would think maybe it's a need to play comeback football?
Yeah, Gronk won't be smashing in this game. I like Martellus Bennett as a GPP play here because I think due to that recency bias, people are going to be off of him. I think that Tom Brady, after coming off of a bad game last week, again, might make for a nice play where his ownership could be slightly deflated based on that recency bias. So I like those two guys in play. I think Julian Edelman will see a little bit more action with Gronk out, so I also like Edelman this week. The running backs are good for New England Patriot fans, but they're not great for DFS fans in my book. With all three of them healthy, it's more difficult to lean on these guys, especially with LA having a decent rush defense. I don't like any of these running backs unless you're going to swing for the fences in a GPP and take one of the passing backs. On the other side of the ball for LA, if I'm Bill Belichick, I'm trying to take away LA's biggest weapons, and I think that's Kenny Britt. So ordinarily I'd be on Kenny Britt in this game, but I don't see him having a big game against New England. I think that's who they're going to scheme against. So I really don't like anyone on the LA side of the ball.
Well, let's move on and around the horn to you, Devin, and you're up in the next contest we're going to discuss, which is KC at Atlanta. Kansas City with the big overtime win, and certainly the first half put you to sleep. Second half lit up your scoreboard if you had anybody in, including the freak, Tyreek Hill, whose speed is insane and crazy, and if you're going up against an Atlanta team that lost Desmond Trufant, you're probably going to get Jeremy Maclin back, and we don't normally think of Kansas City as a high-octane offense, but they may need to be. You got to break out of that shell if Atlanta does what they could on the flip side with their own guy, Taylor Gabriel. And what's interesting to note, besides Julio Jones, who we all know and love and appreciate, but on a talk about maximizing your touches, Gabriel, since week 8, is the number 7 fantasy wide receiver on a points-per-game basis in PPR leagues, and he's done that on only 18 targets. So what he can work as a runner on jet sweeps. He scored 4 touchdowns during that time to help boost those numbers and boost Matt Ryan and those prospects. Of course, Tevin Coleman, Devontae Freeman, lots of interesting players here. And I understand, and I'm going to be, waiting with popcorn on Detroit and New Orleans. KC and Atlanta, another good game I'm excited to watch this week. Devin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Tyreek Hill's really turning into almost what we saw from Tavon Austin last year, where he's just so fast that you have to get him the ball. So Tyreek Hill might be the fastest player in the NFL, at least this year. Taylor Gabriel, as you mentioned, also has a ton of speed. He ran a 4.26 40 in his pro day. It was wind aided, so it's a little bit non-traditional as far as is it really a 4.26. But he's shown this year that he is very fast in Gabriel. But I've seen Gabriel play quite a bit as a Browns fan, and to be honest, what he's doing right now is probably fool's gold. You're going to have people who are on him just because they've seen the 76-yard touchdown or they've seen the 35-yard touchdown that he had last week. But he's just a guy. I mean, he's 5'8", standing on a box. He might be 5'5". He's listed at 5'8", but there's no way he's 5'8". He's listed at 165. He might be 140. He's probably one of, if not the smallest players in the NFL. And I think that now he's starting to have success, that the opposing team's going to start game planning for him. The one player I really like in this game is Julio Jones. He's going up against Marcus Peters, who Peters has been making a lot of plays, but he's been giving up a lot of plays. So he takes a lot of risks when he covers opposing wide receivers. Which, if you take a lot of risk against Julio Jones, you're going to get burnt at some point. So Julio's a guy who hasn't done – he's kind of stayed under the radar this year outside of that 300-yard game that we saw earlier this year. But Andy Reid has already mentioned that he's concerned with how they're going to defend him. And I think he's a good sneaky play because he hasn't been the traditional Julio Jones that we've seen in the past. He's not on pace for there was talks of him getting close to 2,000 yards. He's only at 1,140 through 11 games. So he's on pace for right around 1,600, but a lot of that came in that 300-yard game against Carolina. He's coming off a 35-yard game last week, and I just think that he's going to be a guy who will be in a lot of my lineups this week.
Does KC turn on the gas? Do they put their foot on the gas at all besides Freak? Maybe a Kelsey? Anything there, Devin?
Yeah, I mean, Kelsey's a guy who it's hard to – I can never predict when he's going to have a good game. I always seem to be on the wrong side of him. But, Kelsey is a guy that I think that Kansas City's really going to have to score in this game. It's at Atlanta. Atlanta in the Dome is a better team, and it should be a relatively high-scoring game. So we see Kelsey had 15 targets last week against Denver and has gone for 100 yards in the last 2 weeks. So he hasn't been scoring touchdowns, though, which is a concern for a tight end. I typically like to have someone who is getting those red zone looks. But 100 yards, 15 targets, 9 targets the week before, 6, 7, 10 over his last 5 games for a tight end that is still relatively inexpensive. Is a decent play this week.
All right, Pasquino, you get to wrap us up in the top stories, and we're talking about Roethlisberger at home. Yay! You know what that means. Lots and lots of points. What does it mean for Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, et cetera? Your other assets you would look to on the Steelers. Any sort of sneaky play out there, an Eli Rogers, a GPP for Kobe Hamilton. Any love there, JP? And also, on the flip side, I mentioned the apology from Eli Manning to Sterling Shepard. Do you believe that squeaky wheel is going to get some grease? And yes, Odell Beckham Jr., yep, fine. But we know that it's bend but don't break defense with Pittsburgh. We know their best pass rusher is 100 years old. So is there something more there for guys like Jennings, guys like Shepard this week?
I think this game's going to be really interesting. I think that you're looking at a score that's probably right in the middle. And I think it's going to be like 31-27, kind of a relatively high-scoring game. But it's interesting for a number of reasons. Both teams they struggle with receiving backs, and both teams have good receiving backs. Le'Veon Bell, Rashad Jennings. Jennings is not in Bell's caliber, but they're both going to be productive. They both have wide receiver ones. They both can produce points in the passing game. But it's interesting that the Giants have been really good against the pass of late. They haven't given up more than one touchdown through the air since per game since week 5. Aaron Rodgers is the last quarterback to throw more than have a multi-pass touchdown game against them. So I don't know if Ben's going to have that great of a game. It's the caliber wasn't so great, but I think you're going to be kind of a middle of the road. All your stars will probably score once each, and it's going to come down to the last possession kind of game. I think it's going to be production, but I don't think it's going to be absolute GPP type production.
Well, and we know in the history between Eli and Ben, it's in Ben's favor in terms of wins, 2-1. But Ben throws a lot more, makes a lot of mistakes. Eli only averages about 160 yards passing against the Steelers for his career. Let's talk about Vegas, a place that we all love and enjoy. And I'm going to start with you this week. John, you are up to tell us about Vegas and these line movements, including Houston to Green Bay, the aforementioned Giants at Steelers, and New England with the Gronk news having an effect on Vegas. How's it change your DFS takes, John?
Yeah, it's definitely something you want to be monitoring. And this is, a tip, I guess. I tell everybody when they start tweeting at me on Sunday morning with regards to weather, I think there will be a few weather games that are concerned this weekend. I believe Green Bay and maybe Chicago. People tweet at me quite a bit saying, well, is this taking you off of this player? And my answer is the same every time. See what Vegas is telling you. If the line is dropping at Vegas, then that means that the weather is real and that you should be concerned about it. Outside of that, I really don't pay a whole lot of attention to the weather. Now, where these games are concerned, I think I'll let maybe Devin talk more about it because I know he was interested in talking more about these particular games. Each one of these is a personnel issue for the most part. And then there's some gambling that also comes into play in terms of why lines move. But I'll let Devin and maybe some of the other guys handle that. The one thing I wanted to talk about here is this Carolina-Seattle game. I think this game is very interesting for tournament play this weekend. It's a 44.5-point total, which I think will be enough to keep a lot of people off of it. But the last 3 games these teams have played have been 55 points, 50 points, and 48 points. That's a lot of points for 2 teams that we traditionally think to have great defenses. And we know that we saw it last week, the Seahawks defense is banged up. We know that both of these offenses have disappointed recently. Cam Newton hasn't done a whole lot in the second half of the season. Russell Wilson's coming off of a stinker of a game. The entire Seahawks offense is coming off a stinker of a game. And yet, I think this game is in play because for those reasons, recency bias, everything's going to be under-owned. I think you can look to a lot of different players on this particular slate and on this game and load up on them at low ownership because the Vegas total is middle of the road, but recent history has told us this could be a very high-scoring game.
Hell hath no fury like a fantasy owner scorned. Devin, you're up with Vegas. Since John called you up, let's talk about Vegas.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit of clarification to add a little bit to what John was saying about line movements. Line movements are as important as anything you can really check on a given Sunday. So typically, if it moves 1 point, it's not a huge deal. If it moves 2 points, the weather is real. And from a line movement perspective, keep an eye on those close numbers or those big numbers. So 3, 4, and 7, or any multiple of those, so 10, 13, 14. Anything that crosses those boundaries is typically a number that's important. If a line moves from 5 to 6, it's really not that important from a overall game perspective. It's really when it crosses one of those barriers, if you will, that you should really start paying attention. So what I typically do is I'll look at 2 points for the over-under if it drops, and then if it touches or if it crosses one of those thresholds of 3, 4, 7, and then just keep adding them up as you keep going. Getting into game perspective, the one game that, when I'm looking at Vegas, I'm really trying to look at what surprises me every week, and Oakland against Buffalo really surprised me at 49 for an over-under. This is a game that Oakland is projected to score 26.5 points against a Buffalo defense that, they haven't been great against the run or the pass, but they haven't been bad either. So this is a game that not a lot of people are talking about. And ultimately it's a game where, Derek Carr with a dislocated finger, I would have expected a much lower over-under. So it tells me that Vegas isn't as concerned about Derek Carr's finger as I might be, which means that I will probably have some Derek Carr because of that.
Confidence in the glove. Maurile, you're up next to talk about Vegas. And how much confidence do you have, and which games do you have that confidence?
My philosophy, Cecil, is Vegas comes out with lines that are really hard to beat. They're not unbeatable. There are people to beat them regularly, but those people generally spend something like 40 hours a week to do it. And from my standpoint, I don't want to spend 40 hours a week to try to, get a 5% edge over the Vegas line. I'd rather take what it gives me and spend all my time on breaking down with individual players and how the targets are going to be distributed and so forth. So as a general rule, I don't try to second guess Vegas. I take Vegas's lines as a given and go from there. That said, one of the lines that kind of surprises me this week is Washington at Arizona with a 49.5% over-under. To me, that's too high. Arizona's been struggling offensively for a while. As good as David Johnson is, there's not a lot else going on there. And Washington's got a number of injury problems that make them, pretty unreliable. So based on, I do my projections based on the over-under they give me. And I've got a number of Arizona and Washington players that might look like decent values. My gut kind of disagrees with that and would shy away from those players. And that brings up the question of, do I go with the numbers or my gut? And usually I think it's correct to go with the numbers and not my gut. But I've been burned either way.
Yeah, either way, I think all of us are right there in that boat with you. Pasquino's in the Vegas train. What's Sin City telling you?
Yeah, I look at these numbers pretty hard when I write for the win each week, and Devin's spot on about looking at the numbers. And why Vegas really doesn't want to move past 3 or 7 is because you have sharps betting either side, so you can actually middle the bet. So you can take one team at 6.5, the other team at 7.5, win both sides at 7. That's really why they don't want to pass those kinds of numbers. So if they do that, that's a dramatic move for them, even though it's 1 point. I was going to point out the Arizona-Washington game, and I actually like this game. I think at 49 points, Arizona gave up 38 points last week to Atlanta. So, and Washington has 3 extra days to rest. I understand that you're looking at Jordan Reed probably out, but Kirk Cousins had a fantastic game last week, and he's got a lot of momentum going. So Vegas is telling me that Washington's going to score some points in this game. So I'm going to try and figure out where those points are going to come from. I'm probably going to go in the passing game, and I think that's going to be a very low-owned stack this week.
All right, Austin, you get to wrap us up with the Vegas conversation. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's 2/3 of the teams have an implied total under 24 points. So there's a lot of loading of the points towards the top, the cream of the crop this week. So I'm focused a lot on those 10 teams that are expected to score over 24 points. We've already mentioned a lot of those games. But one of those teams is on Monday Night Football. Don't forget, if you're playing anything with a Monday night slate in it, don't forget about Indy and the Jets. I think there's lots of interesting plays on both sides of the ball here. And I know that they're not on the main slate, but it's a lot of options that you shouldn't forget about. One game that's up high on this list that I'm not so keen on, kind of how Maurile, sort of was wondering why the Arizona-Washington game was so high, and I'm kind of agreement with him on that, is that Green Bay-Houston game. I feel like Houston's strength of its defense is in the passing game, and Green Bay is not good at running the ball. And so I feel like Houston actually matches up pretty well against Green Bay here. I'm not saying Green Bay is going to lose this game, but the numbers that I'm seeing from Vegas in that game seem just a touch high to me. And so that one doesn't get me as excited as some of the other teams that are projected to score around the same amount of points.
Well, let's get into position-by-position analysis here on the Power Grid, Footballguys.com. And we're going to start with the quarterbacks. And Maurile, I'm going to start with you because of a off-camera conversation that we had before the show about what's going on with Denver and Trevor Siemian. We do have some Brady stuff, some Luck stuff. We'll get to all that. But how do things change if Paxton Lynch is in for the Broncos? For me, I can't say what we see at practice, but what I would do is I'd put the kid in the shotgun and go 4 wide, one of those wides being A.J. Derby, so basically 3 wides and a move tight end, and just let him throw. So I don't really think it impacts guys we'll talk about later in wide receivers like Demarius or Emmanuel. If we see Paxton in, I think it would heavily impact the ground game. But how about that sneaky GPP play of the rookie who's been sitting there waiting? And when he did play against Atlanta and when he was in the shotgun, 73% completion, was top 10, 169 yards passing, and 1 touchdown, no INTs out of the shotgun against Atlanta. They didn't do that till it was too late in that game. So, Maurile, let's talk about quarterbacks, not just if Lynch plays. And, again, as of this recording on Thursday, Trevor Siemian did not practice on Wednesday or Thursday, is still in his walking boot. Another injury for this guy. So a lot of quarterback issues to get to. But let's talk QBs with you more. What do you got?
Yeah, early in the week, it looked like Siemian had a pretty good chance of playing. And if that was going to be the case, I actually like Siemian this week. He's been playing pretty well lately, and he's got an excellent complement of receivers. I think I would have liked his value. He's not going to be one of the absolute top point scorers, but if you look in terms of price, points per dollar, I would have liked him this week. But the more recent news is that he probably is not going to play. If he does play, he'll be limited. And so what do we have with Paxton Lynch? And that's a hard question. It makes it a lot harder to do Broncos projections for me with Lynch in there instead of Siemian, because I have a much lesser feel of what Lynch can offer as both a passer and as a guy who runs the offense overall. So that's something that I'm going to have to look at myself over the next day or two before Sunday lineups to solidify my thinking on that. But right now, I think it's a downgrade to the Broncos offense as a whole, just because even though Siemian isn't one of the league's top passers, he did look better to me, especially in recent weeks, than Lynch last time he got a shot. And so Lynch kind of scares me off of a lot of Denver players this week for right now.
Any love for any other quarterbacks out there, Maurile, before we jump around?
There's been a few quarterbacks that we keep waiting to get out of a funk and give us some fantasy points, like Russell Wilson and like Carson Palmer. And I think they're both going to one of these weeks. I don't know if it'll be this week or not, but they're both worth plays in a GPP because I think they're just much better players than they've been showing recently, and they're eventually going to have a big game that are worthy of DFS playing. So those are two guys I'd look at as GPP plays rather than cash game plays.
Austin, you're up next with quarterbacks. We can talk chalk, cash, GPP, or fade. And, Tyrod Taylor versus Oakland, very interesting. Sammy Watkins back last week, looking good there, helping out Tyrod, who can also pick up Gashu on the ground as a runner. So what are we looking at here at the QB position?
Yeah, I think Tyrod Taylor is an interesting play, not in cash. Most of his receiving core is injured. And so I think that if you're going to play him, I would maybe play him as a GPP play and not stack him with anyone. I don't actually trust Sammy Watkins to play a full complement of snaps in this game, the whole game. But Tyrod somehow, I think, is going to find a way to score some points against Oakland. On the cash game side of things, I think that in general, people's sort of structure of their lineups is going to be very focused on trying to get two expensive running backs into their cash game lineups. So I think you have to make a strong call on your quarterback and whether you can afford to pay up at quarterback and still get those two running backs into your lineup, Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson. So Drew Brees is going to be a very popular cash game pick this week, but I think that it's going to be difficult to get Brees, David Johnson, and Le'Veon Bell, all three into your lineup without going cheap at a lot of other places. I like Brees a lot this week. Some people are going to choose to drop down to someone like Colin Kaepernick and be a little bit more risky, I would say, even in cash games, so that they can afford more room to get like Julio also in there or Kelsey also in there. So I think a lot of my lineups are either going to go big with Brees or drop down to Kaepernick, starting to warm up to him being a cash game play this week. Whereas last night's show, I was like not excited about it. But as I build lineups, Kaepernick keeps popping up more and more in my cash game builds.
I see a big smile from Jeff Pasquino when you talk Kaepernick. JP, take it away.
Well, I was going to mention this game on the Vegas part too because it's a big number, and I've been talking with the staff about this game because it's 49 to 50 points. The only downside I see in this game is weather, but this is the only game where you have two quarterbacks who last week had 290-plus passing yards. Now, I know one of them is named Matt Barkley. I understand that. But there's going to be points produced in this game. I think that Jordan Howard's going to run a lot. I think that Kaepernick's going to produce a lot. So the question always is with Kaepernick, who's he going to throw to? But I think you can make a case for his running back, his tight end, or just playing naked Kaepernick. I think that his value is very strong. He's put up a lot of points, and the Bears are just frankly terrible. So you can laugh if you want, but I wouldn't necessarily. I would rather have Brees. Let's be clear. I'd rather have Brees than Kaepernick. if you're pressed for money and you're trying to squeeze in those two top running backs, I would rather go down to Jordan Howard and go up to Breeze than go Kaepernick and a stronger running back. That'd be my preference.
Okay,
We're not
Devin,
laughing at you.
Yeah, Devin.
I agree with your sentiment. I'm laughing at Devin because he likes to throw up the red, and I'm also laughing that you made it through the first segment without mentioning a kicker or a defense yet. So
it's coming.
Trending in the right direction.
Or a punt play, John. Don't forget about that. There's
Or a
three
punt
things.
play.
Devin, super quick before we abandon quarterbacks here.
Yeah.
Why the red? Why the grimace?
The over/under down to 43.5. So it's dropped a little bit, which there is going to be some weather here in Chicago. I'm about 15 miles from Soldier Field, but I do like the Jordan Howard call quite a bit, and we can transition into running backs. But just one name real quick regarding quarterbacks. Andrew Luck is a guy who, if you're playing the Monday night slate, has to be in consideration. He's only 8,100 on FanDuel, and it provides a nice middle ground between Breeze and some of the other cheaper options. So if you're playing the Monday night slate, the problem is he's going to be popular. So people are going to intentionally play the Monday night slate to just play Luck, but he's a guy who I'll be targeting somewhat.
All right, well, Devin, perfect segue for you then into the running back position and other running backs to talk about, including Mark Ingram with a toe. And usually there's certain injuries with running backs. Knees are killer for everyone. But a toe injury, and it's always lingering around turf toe, which is probably what it is, which is one of the most disgusting injuries to imagine and think about. So Ingram here may be creating an opportunity for Tim Hightower. We've got Ryan Matthews, didn't participate in practice, so maybe Wendell Smallwood if you wanted to go cheap at running back there, and Chris Ivory, TJ Yeldon. I'll throw in Denard Robinson, the type of guy that hurts the Broncos GPP-wise. The type of guy is the smaller, the Tevin Coleman, the Tyreek Hill. Those type of smaller players can hurt that Broncos team. So let's get to these running backs, Howard and others.
Yeah, I'm not going Denard Robinson because he went to that school up in Michigan, which we're not going to talk about as a fellow Ohio State guy. The one guy, David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell are going to be the two most popular. I'll let someone else take that. Jordan Howard's the guy that I'm really going with in a lot of lineups. Just looking at San Francisco, and yes, they bottled up Jay Ajayi, but he was without 3 offensive linemen last week. I think with the weather, the 49ers give up 171.8 yards rushing per week, which is by far the most in the NFL. And Howard's been good lately, so he's still relatively inexpensive, and I don't think you have to go up to Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson in this slate. I think that going with Breeze and going with a balanced approach at wide receiver can work, and I'll be doing some of that. This is probably a week that I'll build 2 cash lineups, one with the 2 stud running backs, just in case both of those guys go off. I don't want to be the idiot that didn't take those 2 guys, but I will also have some of Jordan Howard and one of those 2 running backs.
See, Austin, I need you to create a super for us because you got to cover your cash. As Devin's talking about with David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, I'm going to trademark that saying. John, you're up. This segment's all about you, baby. And cover your cash with Johnson, Bell, building your lineup that way. But, GPP, fade, what do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I'm building my lineups first with Johnson and Bell. If I can get them in there and not hate what I've got left, that's how I'll build it. David Johnson has been just tremendous all year. And he's going against the Washington defense that's 32nd DVOA rush defense. They've allowed 25 points per game on DraftKings scoring on average. And now they face the best running back or best fantasy running back in the league. I don't know how you get away from him. And I feel very similarly about Le'Veon Bell this week. But the good news is, and I think Devin touched upon this, there are a lot of options at running back this week. When we get to wide receivers, I think we're going to hear the opposite. A lot of hemming and hawing amongst the experts here, myself included, because there aren't a whole lot of clear-cut examples for cash game plays. But this week, I think you can look at Jeremy Hill, for example. He's getting all the action with Gio Bernard out. And last week, we saw him catch 6 passes out of the backfield, which is something he's never done before without Gio Bernard. He's 4,300, I think, on DraftKings, and he's not much more expensive than that on FanDuel. So if you want to go cheap and maybe spend up and get a Julio Jones, I mean, we've already heard some folks talk about him. You certainly could do that. But outside of him, GPPs, if this turf toe continues, say that 3 times, Tim Hightower against the Detroit Lions front 7. They've been atrocious in defending the run all year. They get a lot of slack for not being able to defend the pass, but they can't defend the run either. So Tim Hightower has looked pretty good this season, despite what we've seen historically with him. And then the last one I'll give you is Carlos Hyde in GPPs against Chicago. Chicago lost Jarrell Freeman a few weeks ago to a PED, and last week they lost another key linebacker with an injury. They're going to be struggling to defend the run without those key components in that linebacking core. So Carlos Hyde continues to get a lot of action. We know they run a lot of plays there in San Francisco. I wouldn't be afraid to go with him because I think he'll be low owned.
What's that? Danny Trevathan's hurt for the Bears? I'm not saying he's the Julius Thomas of linebackers, but usually we do 3, fellas, but give me the green here because I think we should move to wide receiver. There is so much to talk about with wide receiver. So instead of having 3 running back takes, I think we'll leave it to 2 real beefy ones, nice and beefy with John and Devin there. And let's jump into wide receivers. JP, we're going to start with you in this one. Interesting calls this week. You've got so many injuries. You do have a guy like, Macklin coming back. We talked about a little bit. Watkins, who was back last week. Maybe he sees more, but this is where you're going to win or lose, basically. I'm going to sum it up like that. Like quarterback, it's pretty easy. Running back, it's fairly obvious. We'll get to tight ends. That's fairly obvious. Don't dare talk about damn kickers in this segment. But there are a lot of key wide receiver hoops to jump through, and Jeff, you're up first.
Yeah, and you're looking for a bargain. Everybody's to be either searching for that bargain so they can fit in that high-priced tight end or the double running back that we were talking about. So a lot of the wide receiver value I'm seeing is in the 5 to 7K range on FanDuel, and I'm looking at we start with the Detroit New Orleans game. You got Michael Thomas, you got Snead, who's going to have a good matchup, Golden Tate. All those guys are viable cash options. And now we have to throw Julian Edelman in the mix with Gronkowski out. So I think all those guys are going to be viable targets. Julio Jones is rather cheap, relatively cheap for his brand name being he's under $9,000 on FanDuel, but that's pretty expensive to squeeze in right now. So that's where I'm looking at. And another one is Dontrelle Inman for San Diego. If you have injuries that are out there, squeeze him in. I think he's 52, 5,300 on FanDuel. That and Tyreek Hill, it's only if Macklin's out. So those are the bargain bins that I'm looking at. People want to go Antonio Brown. People want to go to OBJ. You're not going to be able to afford it unless you're going down 2 steps on both your running backs, which is a GPP philosophy that could work this week because everybody's going to be on the top 2. And one easy way to diversify, we talked about this before, don't be crazy, just be smart about it. Go to running back 3, running back 4 on your list. And everybody's going to be on 1 and 2, and you'll be diverse just from doing that.
Austin, you're up next at wide receivers. Again, some real complications here because of these injuries.
Yeah, Jeff nailed it here. I agree with all of his picks. The great assessment there. I think that some injuries here to watch out for. Looks like Devontae Parker's not going to play this week for Miami. So, he's been having a couple of good games. Don't look there. I think that guy that I will also be looking at is Mohamed Sanu against Kansas City. It feels like the shorter passing game may be more effective against Kansas City this week with Justin Houston seeing a full complement of snaps last week finally and getting 3 sacks. And then it sounds like Dee Ford is also going to come back and play in this game, who's in their sack leader this year. I think that the Atlanta offensive line is going to have their hands full, and Ryan's going to have to find some more dump-off work this week. I think Sanu could be in for a big game in that respect. As long as the weather isn't crazy, I think you could consider Marquez Wilson again for Chicago, coming off of a solid game last week, a little bit of a rapport with Matt Barkley. But watch that weather real closely, as we talked about before. Then you could look to Cincinnati too. I mean, they're still trying to fill that void with AJ Green and Giovanni Bernard out. I think the guy that you're going to pick to fill that void is Tyler Boyd. Both him and LaFell had 9 targets this past week, but Boyd was far more efficient with them. So if you're going to go with a Cincinnati guy, try to find maybe a lower cost guy. I would look at Tyler Boyd.
And if we look at KC Atlanta, if you were to ask me, like, who's more like Demaryius Thomas? That's pretty easy. It's Julio. Who's more like Emmanuel Sanders? Well, it is Mohamed Sanu. So a good highlight there. John, you're up at wide receivers. And he mentioned Devontae Parker, unlikely to go. GPP for Kenny Stills here and any other wide receivers. Again, this is where everyone's going to win or lose is on this position this week.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to what Marl said about that game, that Miami-Baltimore game. It's just not something that stands out to me as being very attractive. The Baltimore defense early in the season was struggling in the secondary. They pulled it together a little bit as the season's coming to a close, and they're making a playoff push. They're really good up front, so I think that largely eliminates Ajayi from contention, especially now that his salary is up there in the upper stratosphere. So for me, that you get away from a lot of these Dolphins. Even Jarvis Landry, he continues to be expensive despite the fact that he hasn't done anything in a month. So for me, I'm pretty much off of that Miami Dolphins offense. I think that these guys actually hit a lot of the ones that I have my eyes on. I think that Dontrelle Inman, if Tyrell Williams continues not to practice, and we're recording this on Thursday night, if he's not practicing, they have to throw the ball elsewhere. And I would not be afraid to go back to Antonio Gates. We'll talk about tight ends in a minute. But I think that Dontrelle Inman is a guy that has looked really good when they've asked him to perform this season. And he should see some decent targeting at a very fair price across the industry. He's definitely an area that I would be looking to save some money. Rather than rehashing cash game plays that those guys already talked about and saying that I like the same ones, how about I give you a GPP play that I don't think anybody will be on? I haven't read anything anywhere. How about Jeremy Curley with the San Francisco 49ers? Quentin Patton is concussed and not playing, and he runs the exact same kind of routes. That is, Curley runs the same types of routes that Patton does, and Patton was seeing a lot of targets. I would not be surprised in this game to see him targeted 10 times, and I think that he's pretty much site minimum across the industry. And if you like Kaepernick and you're looking for somebody to pair him with, that's who I would be doing it. You can get Kaepernick and Curley for probably less than $10K on DraftKings, opening up $40,000 for the rest of your roster, and then you can really slot in David Johnson. You can get in Le'Veon Bell. You can get in Julio Jones and fill out the rest of your roster and feel really good about it, hoping that if that combo goes off, you're in a great spot.
And just think how much you can spend on kickers. Moral, I want to pick your brain about wide receivers. And one thing I believe we've discussed is how Larry Fitzgerald may be shadowed and followed around. We know in trying to predict who it is behind Larry Fitzgerald, like is it a Michael Floyd week? Is it a John Brown week? Like, who the hell knows? Is Jermaine Gresham actually going to score a touchdown? Bruce Arians always surprised, like, I didn't think that blocker could catch. That's what he thinks of tight ends. But if Norman is following around Larry Fitzgerald, what does that mean? Any wide receiver thoughts here, Moral? You want to get out there?
That's a tough one because a lot of times when you have a top-notch wide receiver against a top-notch corner, my thought is if they're going to try to play it one-to-one, the receiver's going to win often enough to make them worth playing. Larry Fitzgerald might be an exception to that because as great as a receiver as he is, he's not that fast out of his breaks anymore, and he's relying on misdirection more than speed or quickness, and it's hard to win with misdirection against Josh Norman. It just is. So if you take away Fitzgerald as a target, I don't like any other receivers on the Cardinals this week, but it's got to go somewhere. So I think you can take a guess in a GPP league and go with Malcolm Floyd, or take a guess and go with John Brown. But I wouldn't feel comfortable with either of them in a cash game. And with Larry Fitzgerald too. So I'm not – it's a tough thing to go with any of those guys this week, in my view. In terms of receivers in general this week, I would like to agree with Austin about agreeing with Jeff. I think Jeff named most of the same guys I would name. This is a week where the high-priced running backs, there's a top 3 or 4 group of running backs. There's a bigger separation between them and the guys beneath them than there is between the top few receivers and the guys beneath them. So this is a week where if I'm going to pay up, I'm going to do it at running back and then look for more bargains at receiver. So as much as I'd like to have Julio Jones and Mike Evans and Odell Beckham, this is probably not the week I'm going to have those guys. I'm going to look a little bit further down the list for lower price players. And one of the guys I like is Tyreek Hill. He's gotten 28 targets over the last 3 weeks. That's with Macklin out each of those 3 weeks. If Macklin comes back, it dims Hill's chances a bit. But I still think he's such a better receiver than Albert Wilson or Chris Conley that I wouldn't mind going with Hill even if Macklin comes back and plays a little bit, because I think Macklin would be a bit limited. Another guy that I don't think has been mentioned in the segment is Golden Tate. With the game script going the way we expect it to go with New Orleans and Detroit, Golden Tate's been kind of hot lately, especially compared to Marvin Jones. And he's only 5,900 on FanDuel. That makes him a pretty good bargain to me.
Well, let's move to the tight end position, and Devin, that's all you. And when we look at some interesting plays, including Jimmy Graham, including Zach Ertz, we've got Panthers and Bengals in the bottom 5 against tight ends. And when we look at Jordan Matthews a little bit banged up, I did talk about Ryan Matthews earlier in the show. Could it just lead to more and more of Ertz, Devin?
Yeah, as you mentioned, bottom 5 as far as defending the tight end. Zach Ertz and Jimmy Graham should be great plays this week. Ertz had a down week last week, but the past couple of weeks he's looked better compared to what he looked early on in the season. The other guy I really like this week is Vance McDonald. So over the last 5 weeks, he's gone 6, 6, 6, 6, 8 as far as targets. So we mentioned in one of the very early shows of this season that Chip Kelly loves his tight ends. It's the primary read in a lot of plays, and we're finally starting to see that. So with Colin Kaepernick, he's seen a significant amount more touches than what he did with Blaine Gabbert. So he's very inexpensive. I believe he's 2,800 on DraftKings and only 4,900 on FanDuel. So he's probably one of my favorite plays this week. But as you mentioned, Jimmy Graham and Zach Ertz are both great plays.
Tight end position for you, Austin. Who stands out? We've talked a lot about New Orleans versus Detroit, but have yet to talk about Coby Fleener or Josh Hill.
We usually say, hey, find Detroit and figure out which tight end to start against them. I don't trust the usage of these two guys enough to lean on either one of them in this game. It would not surprise me if, we saw a touchdown by one or both of them in this game, but I don't think one of them is going to stand out enough for me to jump all over him. One set of pricing that I really like is Hunter Henry is only 2,900 over on DraftKings. He's way more expensive on FanDuel, but for some reason he's super cheap over on DraftKings. He's a guy that I'm squeezing in at the tight end position for some salary relief. And then Travis Kelce, I think, is going to be the highest owned tight end this week. He's just coming off back-to-back 100-yard games, and Atlanta's terrible against the tight end. He's going to be super high owned. Other tight ends worth mentioning. Jordan Reed doesn't look like he's going to play in this game. I would not look to find value in Vernon Davis here. The Arizona defense is crazy good against the tight end, so don't get cute and try to play Vernon Davis as a GPP play here. I'm fading the tight ends from Washington.
John, you're up to wrap us up on tight ends. I see the green sign there. And when we look overall on all of these tight ends and some interesting plays, are you paying up? Are you paying down at the position? And cash GPP, doesn't matter. Which ones should we be discussing? Should we be considering? And how much? I'll throw a curveball at you. Just because his usage is going up, and yeah, there may be a different quarterback, but AJ Derby, a guy that keeps moving up the list in terms of targets and snaps.
All right. Well, I can tell you, you got me one week on the Derby talk, and I actually threw him into a GPP, and I don't think he got a target. So he
got the first target of the game, and he dropped it. It was in his first game with Denver.
So I can't get on board with Derby until I see him getting more action. I will say I bet Bill Belichick is a little apprehensive or regretful this morning that he let Derby go with the news that we got this afternoon about Gronkowski, but that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
This week, I think that this position is really kind of homogenous. You're going to see a lot of overlap. There isn't a whole lot to like, in my opinion. Travis Kelce's the standout candidate for me. He has been heavily targeted over the past month, and I think that he'll continue to be as long as Macklin is limited and or out. And this week he gets an excellent matchup against the Falcons defense. It just hasn't defended the tight end position very well this year. In terms of GPPs, and it's probably good that you came to me, Cease, because there's an internal Slack conversation that we said we were going to have it out tonight. And
Fight.
Devin is breaking out his red Black-Eyed Joe at the moment to give me a lot of slack over the recommendation of Ladarius Green this week with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think Ladarius Green is in play in all formats, including cash games, because he's so cheap. He's $2,800 on DraftKings, and he's $4,500 on FanDuel. And what he allows me to do with my FanDuel roster, I really like. Mike Tomlin has gone on record saying that Green is going to get more targets or more snaps this week. And if you look at what he has done with limited snaps, he's garnered 26% of targets. Let me rephrase that. In his limited number of snaps, he's been targeted 26% of the time. I don't think that is sustainable, and I'll say that, hey, if he gets 15% targeting, I can live with that because of the number of plays that I expect in this game, because of the strength of the outside cornerbacks there. Janoris Jenkins and Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie are going to be tough, and they're going to close up holes. And so I think there'll be a lot of stuff underneath and in the middle. And if Ladarius Green is a bigger part of the game plan, I love him. And I think that at 4,500, if he gets me 9 points, what is that? That's like 4 catches, 5 catches, and 50 yards. That's more than enough to allow me to get those high upside guys that I feel much safer about elsewhere. And now I'll hand it off to Devin because I know he wants to come back at me.
Yeah.
And Devin, before you jump in, I will add this because now, John, I'm going to go at you because last week AJ Derby played 40 snaps, had 4 targets, 4 catches, 43 yards. Ladarius Green, who you love, and I want you to get that drop, Austin, and let's just play it on a loop. I love him. 14 snaps, 3 targets, 2 catches, 67 yards. Anyway, Devin, you're up. Hammer away.
Yeah, 14 snaps last week. So if he gets significantly more snaps this week, what is that, 20 snaps? What's his realistic upside even if he stays at 25% of snaps? If he sees 25 snaps, that's only 4 or 5 targets. He had a big play last week against DeQuell Jackson, who's about 75 years old, who's been around the league for, 10 plus years, and really couldn't cover anyone for a majority of his career when he was in Cleveland. I haven't watched him too much this year, but Father Time always wins, and I don't think he's getting any faster. Indianapolis gave up the highest production to C.J. Fedorowicz this year. They've also been burned by a couple other tight ends. Delaney Walker had a big game. So they are very susceptible to tight ends, to big plays, to tight ends. I just don't think – in GPPs, I can totally see it. I just don't think he's cash viable. Like I said, there's safer guys out there, especially on FanDuel, where he is 4,500, but – Vance McDonald's 4,900 and Zach Ertz 5,300. So you're not saving that much money. It's a matter of going down at defense or going down at a wide receiver. And we've talked about the parity and uncertainty at wide receiver. Why would you want a uncertain tight end as well?
Anything back at him, John?
The only thing I'm going to say back at him, I actually don't disagree with a lot of what he said. I do, however, think that he's going to get more than 20 to 25 snaps this week. Jesse James has been trending down. Ladarius Green is trending up. He's been the superior receiver. All the pieces are there for him to play more time. And I'll close it out by saying that I'm winning 1-0 because Dorial Green Beckham more than reached value last week when I caught a lot of slack in the show.
I'm doubling down this week.
All right, let's move on. Defense and kickers. Pasquino, this is basically all you. So take it away. You have the floor.
He has a new boyfriend.
Oh my God! Is there a new picture up there, Jeff?
Yes. My bane of that last week, it's Justin Tucker. So, yeah, had I had Justin Tucker in the right lineup last week, I would have been joining John in Los Angeles in a couple of weeks, but I digress. There's lots of kickers this week to consider. You basically want to stick with a high-scoring game. Before I get to the kickers, though, I think I need to touch on defense as well. I think we're going to hit with three main ones. I'll throw out the GPP one because the dollars are so important this week. Philadelphia considers a defense against Cincinnati. They are favored on the road, but they match up really well against the Bengals. They're good against tight ends. They're good against running backs. They're good against wide receivers. That's exactly the recipe that Cincinnati has. They don't have good wide receivers. They're pretty good at the other things. So I think they score a lot on special teams and create turnovers. So Philadelphia, $4,300 on FanDuel. That's $600 is important this week. I really like them as a GPP play. Kickers, back to my favorite topic, of course. There's plenty of kickers out there. Matt Bryant, who I went with last week, let me down some. I think he's going to be very highly owned. But Gostkowski's going to be very owned as well at $200 less at $4,900. And Josh Lambo is probably my favorite cheap kicker at $4,600. Justin Tucker is going to be their GPP guy. He hasn't missed at all in the last weeks. The Ravens struggled to punch it in from the red zone. He's the most expensive kicker at $5,200, and that alone will make him very hard to fit in, which will create diversity and uniqueness in your lineup at $5,200.
All right, give me the green or the red. Who wants to talk D's and kickers? John's going to be red, I bet. Okay, Devin, you're up, and then Maurile after that. Devin, what do you got?
This is more of just a quick PSA. So as the weather continues to get worse in certain parts of the country, put more weight on your dome kickers and your warm weather kickers. There's no reason, it's going to snow in Green Bay. It's going to be a sleeting ice mixture in Chicago on Sunday. So really make sure that you're targeting kickers in good weather. We've seen in the past that it doesn't always matter, but if you had to kick in perfect conditions versus a rock hard ball in 20-degree temperatures, it does make a difference. So that's basically target high-scoring kickers in high-scoring games. So Cairo Santos, Will Lutz, Matt Bryant, those are the types of kickers I'm going after.
Defenses and kickers with Maurile Tremblay.
I think there are two defenses that really stand out this week, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed it, so they're going to be popular, highly owned defenses, but sometimes you just got to go with the chalk when it presents itself, and that's the Patriots going in, a Bill Belichick defense going against a rookie quarterback with the Rams against Goff, and then also the Denver Broncos with their tremendous pass rush against Blake Bortles and the Jaguars. Both of those could get pretty messy this week pretty quick. They're both, especially Denver's is expensive on FanDuel. It's $5,000. I think it's worth it. Patriots are $4,600, which isn't much more than the $4,400 or $4,500 defenses that are often considered bargains. But those are if I have leftover money, I'm going Denver. Otherwise, I'm going Patriots, and that's pretty much it for me this week on D.
And the difference between the Patriots and Denver is the difference between Ladarius Green and Vance McDonald.
Good point.
It's the green for that.
There's one other defense we should mention. I think Austin has mentioned it before, and that's Baltimore. Baltimore's getting a lot of consideration this week against Miami, and they're also pretty relatively cheap at $4,600. So those are your three top defenses that I thought we'd get to.
Were you just bringing that up so you could talk about Justin Tucker again?
Sure.
Don't forget to stack Baltimore. The Ratbirds.
I'll get to that in a minute.
Sorry, as a Steelers fan, I cannot support the Ravens, except for Tucker. I start him almost every week, like you should have, Jeff. Anyway, let's talk stacks. Very painful. Very painful. I'm not that mean. Let's talk stacks with you, John. You're up first. Who are your favorite stacks in Week 13?
Yeah, so I think one of my favorite stacks has got to be one I've already talked about. That's Drew Brees to Willie Snead. They just have a huge team total, great matchup, a lot of overflow that direction. I think that's a premier matchup this week that I want to take advantage of. I'll go off the radar on my second one. Talked about this one last night. Pure GPP. Don't even go anywhere near it in your cash games. But Braxton Miller's a guy that's seeing a lot more action there in Houston. I'm not a big fan of Osweiler. I don't think anybody is. But Braxton Miller has an elite matchup this week against Micah Hyde, who is allowing about 80% of passes to be completed that are thrown in his direction. He's got an NFL worst QB rating of 145 when thrown into his direction. And as I said, I think the Texans are going to want to see what this guy can do as they're heading into the next season. So he's becoming more of a role in that offense, and he's site minimum. You'll get him at less than 2% owned, which makes him a really good stack in my opinion.
Austin, stack him up in Week 13.
I think my favorite super stack of the week is on the San Diego game. I think a lot of people aren't going to be on this because the total is not as high as some of the other games. So I'd like to stack up Rivers, Inman, and Hunter Henry, and then also play the other side and put Evans into the stack as well. I'm not scared off from these San Diego pass catchers, even if Williams plays, because I think that shoulder injury is going to really limit his range in terms of his ability to catch passes. And so I kind of hope he does play and is active so people are off of Inman, because I'm still going to be playing Inman even if he's suiting up for this game. So that's my favorite stack there. Another one I'll be looking at is for a Russell Wilson, Doug Baldwin bounce back. I like what John was saying earlier about that game feeling like the Vegas total is too low, and there's a lot of shootout potential, Seattle, Carolina.
Yeah, and the recency bias, everyone's going to feel burned because everyone had him in last week. If we talk Chargers, then I automatically think two people, David Dodds and Maurile Tremblay. So, Maurile, you got to talk about your stacks in Week 13.
All right. Stacks are normally associated with GPP plays, and that's correct theory because they have higher variance, which is what you're looking for in GPPs. And one of the things that you've got to consider when you pick a guy to stack like Drew Brees, for example, you've got to guess. Are you going to pair him with Michael Thomas or with Brandon Cooks or with Willie Snead? Or if you're going to pick Aaron Rodgers, you pair him with Jordy Nelson or with Devontae Adams. And that's fine for a GPP because if you guessing wrong doesn't kill you. Guessing right is awesome. So it's perfectly a good strategy. I'm going to mention that there's also a time when you can use a stack in a cash game. I don't want to get too much into GPP versus cash game theory, but there is a school of thought that says if you find a good enough bargain, go ahead and use the stack in a cash game. And what you don't want to do in that situation is leave yourself guessing. Should I pair him with this receiver or that receiver? And this week, I think the safe stack that you can consider in a cash game is Matt Ryan to Julio Jones. I think they're both pretty decent values on their own. And you don't really have to guess. If Matt Ryan does well, it's very likely going to be because Julio Jones does well also. And so that's, if I were going to play a stack in a cash game, that's the one I would go to.
He's got fat stacks. Usually when we're in Vegas, he's Jeff Pasquino. Who's your fat stacks in Week 13?
I like some of the stacks I already mentioned, but I'll throw two out there that are going to be lesser owned, but mostly because of the diversity at wide receiver. Again, most of the wide receivers we're looking at in this, again, FanDuel pricing are mid 6,000. So I know a lot of people don't like the Baltimore game, but there's a big revenge narrative that's going out with Mike Wallace, and he tweeted it out last week that he mentioned 7 days against Miami. The last time this happened was 3 years ago, and 2 years ago, with Joe Flacco force-fed Steve Smith against Carolina, and you just lit them up. Again, this is GPP, but I can definitely see a path where that Mike Wallace gets a ton of targets, gets 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against his former team, just shoves it right down their throats. So if that happens, you want to be on the right side of it. Now, I'm definitely going to have a lineup that features that. And that's going to be very low on because no one thinks it's going to happen. It's a low total. So I really like that stack. The other stack I'm looking at, again, going back to the Washington game, I like Kirk Cousins. But who do you throw to? When Jordan Reed's out, I think Jamison Crowder. And I think that's going to be the guy who's going to be targeted a lot. He gets a lot of targets. I think he's got a good matchup. He's going up against, I think, Matthew. It's going to be he's going to see a ton of targets, and I think that's the stack. Again, he's priced 6,500, 6,600, right there in the mix with Edelman, Snead, Tate. So all these guys will be right in the mix, and they're going to be overlooked for other guys. So if you're looking for a nice GPP stack, Cousins to Crowder is going to be a nice feature.
Devin, you're our final analyst to talk about stacks in Week 13.
Yeah, I like the Cousins one. Tyrann Mathieu is looking questionable. He didn't practice again today, so thanks, Jeff, for stealing mine. The other one that I like this week is Derek Carr and Amari Cooper. So I mentioned earlier that it's pretty surprising that the total is as high as it is. And I want guys who are not going to be highly owned. So Carr didn't seem to miss a beat when he put on the glove. He actually played better than when he had the glove or didn't have the glove on and didn't have the dislocated finger. One other stack that I like this week is going back to Russell Wilson and Doug Baldwin. So many people were burned last week by those two that I think their ownership percentage will be lower than it otherwise should be. We've seen what receivers can do against Carolina. We saw Julio Jones go for 300 yards. Doug Baldwin, last year had a huge second half of the year. He started to show that he was going to go on a similar trend, and then he had a disappointing game last week. So I'm not afraid to go back to it. I typically like to take a look at who was the most burnt players last week. So which players disappointed the most that were the most popular, and those were two of them. So going back to those if they're in a good matchup, which they are, is not a bad strategy.
As we wrap up the Week 13 edition of the Power Grid, we will do our parting thoughts where we go around the room just with some final bits of advice or points that you want to hammer home. And Austin, you are our first hammer. So what are some of your parting thoughts this week?
Well, on the big sites with live finals, it's sort of your last week to get that ticket to the big events coming up. John Lee has his for the FanDuel event, and we're excited for him there. If you're also gunning for these events, feel free to push into them a little bit extra, but not too much extra. These are really top-heavy events. Just be very conscious of your bankroll management and don't get too caught up in the excitement of chasing a live finals ticket this week just because it's the last chance. Oh my goodness. So really be careful with your bankroll this week. I think it's a week where you can go overboard with chasing those tickets.
Pat Squino, you got the green up. What are your parting thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with Austin. And then speaking of bankroll management, the more I listened to everybody talking this week, the more I heard similar thoughts about everybody's going to be the same running back. Everybody's going to be trying to squeeze the same wide receivers that we're all going to be on. The fact that everybody liked the wide receivers I mentioned kind of cautions me about cash games this week, which means there's going to be a lot of overlap. So be very careful this week playing too much cash if all the lineups are going to be the same, because you're going to be decided by kickers or a tight end, or if you have 4 or 5 guys that match everybody else, this will be very hard to differentiate. So it may be a good week to back off a little bit on your cash play, maybe throw a little bit more tournaments, but be a little bit cautious if everybody seems to be in the same names this week.
Unless you're Jeff Pasquino, who loves kickers. So it's his week, he's going all in on cash.
Yeah, do it. That's what he does. John Lee, with your parting thoughts.
All right, so building on both of these guys' previous statements with regards to playing these qualifiers and the amount of overlap that we're discussing this evening, I think one thing you can do that's smart for GPPs always is to leverage what you know about groupthink. This week we know that everybody's going to like Drew Brees, for example. If Drew Brees you suspect is going to be highly owned, there is a distinct possibility this week that a guy like Tim Hightower could have a big day. We've already talked about it earlier in the show, so I won't go into it again. But Tim Hightower could have a big day, and he's going to go extremely low owned because everybody else loves Drew Brees and Willie Snead. And so what you can do is you can gain access to that game and that 30-point team total at low ownership and really leverage the rest of your roster, because there you've built your uniqueness and you can do everything else with the masses. And that's that's kind of an advanced play that not a lot of people think about. But if Hightower goes off and Drew Brees doesn't, you're already ahead of 30% of the field. And so think of leverage plays that you can exploit.
Maurile Tremblay, our special guest this week, you get to give us your parting thoughts.
I would say that as someone who does individual player projections, this week strikes me as a harder week than normal to figure out exactly what's going to happen, because there are so many injury situations where it's not sure if a guy's going to play, or if he does play, how limited he'll be, and it just makes it all the more difficult. But don't let that discourage you from playing your normal slate of games, because if it's hard for us, it's hard for everybody. It's hard for your opponents too. And DFS, you're never graded in an absolute sense. You don't have to, like, if you reach 120 points, you win, otherwise you lose. It's always on a curve compared to your opponent. And if it's difficult for you, it's difficult for your opponents. If it's easy for you, it's easy for your opponents. It's easy to think, this is an easy week, I'll play a lot. This is a difficult week, I'll really limit things. I think both of those are an incorrect way to approach it. I think whether the week seems easy or hard to you really shouldn't affect the amount that you play, because you're graded on a curve against your opponents, and it's just as easy or hard for them as it is for you.
Sage-like advice from Maurile Tremblay. And now Devin Knotts, and a little discussion about Hoops Guys. Devin?
Yeah, before I get into Hoops Guys, just one quick thing to build on it being such a chalky week. Instead of playing 50-50s this week, you might just want to play a number of head-to-head games, because if those chalk plays are going to be 60-70% owned, in 50-50s, you really don't get an advantage there, versus if you have a head-to-head contest against somebody who, if they're 60-70% owned in a head-to-head, guess what? There's 30% of the people that don't have them in it. And if they do go off like we expect them to, you're most likely going to win those contests. So I typically go with that strategy a lot. Is I'll just play, instead of playing one 50-50, I'll just play a lot of small head-to-head contests. But, just evaluate what works for you and what works for your bankroll. Regarding Hoops Guys, we're about a month and a half in, and doing player projections every day, updating news, having several articles per day. So our free period has come to an end. So we are going to have a free week coming closer to Christmas. So if you missed out and you're still wondering, hey, what's Hoops Guys? Check us out as we get closer to Christmas, or just, it's the lowest subscription rate of any daily content provider that is providing daily projections in the articles that we are providing. Other sites are charging a monthly fee. We're charging one low flat fee of $25 for the year. So it's a very good discount. If you're looking to play NBA, I highly suggest it. NBA is a sport where it's very difficult to build lineups by hand. You really need some sort of tool or some sort of optimizer to build those. And we have what I think is one of the best optimizers out there. So check us out, hoopsguys.com. Feel free to leave me feedback, or at Twitter at Twitter, it's at hoopsguys. So hoopsguys.com, and I hope you check us out.
That is hoopsguys.com. He is Devin Knotts. And Devin, you missed a little spot shaving this week. So,
All right. It's been a long week, man.
Yeah, it has. Jeff Pasquino showering at work. That's how busy that guy is. He's Austin Lee at the new haircut, little trim there. Looking good. John Lee, as always. And, of course, our special guest, Maurile Tremblay, who we all love and appreciate. I am your host, Cecil Lammy, saying thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, too. As always, stay frosty. Jazz hands. There we go.